Good morning, everybody. I'm Jim Himes, chairman of the Select Committee on Economic Disparity and Fairness and Growth, and am joined in person with my friend and ranking member, Brian Stile. I imagine that members will come in and out. Some will tie in remotely, but don't let the usual rhythms of the Congress throw you, especially. And I apologize for being a few minutes late. There's an awful lot going on out there, but we're delighted you're with us. And this is very much explicitly something that the committee has tried to do, which is a roundtable, not a hearing. So even though we're sitting across from each other, not on a round table, the whole point of this is to break out of the limits and awkward construction of a hearing so that we can have a dialogue and ask each other questions and follow up and that sort of thing. So the plan will be, I'll make just a minute or two of brief remarks, as will the ranking member, and then I'll just ask you to, our not witnesses, our guests today, to just speak for 3 or 4 minutes on the topic that we're here to talk about, and then I'll recognize members as they. I'm going to try to avoid seniority of people, members. If they want to say something, just turn your card sideways. But really, the point here is to get a dialogue going rather than to do a series of speeches. And so we're thrilled that you are all here today, and I'm delighted that Mr. Stile proposed this as a roundtable. The issue of addiction, of course, is both a symptom and a cause of the economic disparity and devastation that is the subject of this committee. My own community in Connecticut, we know what the national figures are in terms of addiction and overdose deaths. My own community in Connecticut, which is an affluent community by and large on average, is worse than most in the region. And it's an indication of the fact that really no community is exempt from the horrors of addiction and opioids in particular, most recently. It's also a really challenging problem. We've been fighting the war on drugs, the quote war on drugs, for more than a generation, my lifetime, and we have not won that war. We've been very aggressive about attacking the supply chains, but the numbers in terms of overdose deaths and that sort of thing are as bad today as they ever have been. And so I hope that this conversation today really floats ideas that can help address this issue, not just from an economic standpoint, which is the subject of this committee, but obviously to try to reduce the human pain and horror that is out there. So with that, I'll be quiet and ask Brian to say anything he wants to say.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm looking forward to today's discussion on substance abuse. I think it's one of the biggest challenges facing Americans today. I was excited to see the President bring this up last night in the State of the Union. I think today is an opportunity for us to discuss some of the policy solutions to the challenge that I think we all know we're facing. Addiction to drugs like alcohol, cocaine, methamphetamine, and now synthetic opioids like fentanyl really have disastrous impacts on people from all walks of life. And while addiction comes in many forms, today I want to really dive into the focus on substance abuse. Substance abuse can destroy the lives of individuals and tear apart families. Recently, we've seen overdose deaths among young people skyrocket due to substance abuse in particular. And based on the data, we know that it thrives often where traditional societal support structures fail. When family-sustaining jobs aren't readily available, substance abuse rises. When strong family support at home fails, substance abuse increases. When dangerous drugs become normalized in a community, substance abuse worsens. When all these factors stack on top of one another, substance abuse can really fester. It's also, I think, important to understand that substance abuse is not unique to any one racial group, any one specific geographic area, or any one gender. Its problems has permeated communities across the country, from the streets of San Francisco to the foothills of Appalachia. In all these places where substance abuse is widespread, though, I think we see some pretty familiar issues. Where substance abuse thrives, economic output declines, meaning lower incomes at home and less money stimulating our local communities. And this creates a smaller tax base that is even more struggling to contain our communities and our quality of life. This means there's greater things for assistance in fighting the substance abuse crisis, leading to further stress on social services. And these challenges drive up costs to fund community investments from education to law enforcement to employment programs because we're spending money addressing the substance abuse challenges. And there's a number of dangerous effects stemming from substance abuse, specifically overdose deaths. And today, we're going to look at the tools to address substance abuse, especially when overdoses are hitting record highs. I think it's due in part to fentanyl and fentanyl-related substances, a topic that the President noted last night. Fentanyl, being a synthetic opioid, is 50 times more potent than heroin and responsible for over 64,000 deaths over a 12-month period last year. And after speaking to doctors, police officers, and local advocates at a fentanyl roundtable in my home community in Racine, I saw how this can affect people in our community. It's the leading cause of death for individuals aged 18 to 45. It's killed more people than car accidents, more people than COVID, more people than heart disease in that demographic 18 to 45. And it's especially scary, I think, because it can kill someone in a first-time use. And it's often laced into other counterfeit drugs, often like Adderall or other similar drugs. And this unique threat requires, I think, pretty serious action. We're seeing Mexican cartels traffic it across our southern border in record numbers. Last year, 15,000 pounds of fentanyl were seized by DEA agents across the country. That's up over 1,000% from the year before, when it would have the potential to kill every American 4 times over. I think that scales the seriousness of the challenge. And the dangerous nature of this drug is why I've led 100 of my Republican colleagues in demanding that we schedule this as a permanent Schedule I drug because it's so dangerous. And doing so will give law enforcement the tools they need to pull this drug off the streets and arrest dealers who try to poison our communities. I think another step we can take to keep fentanyl out of reach is to keep it out of the country in the first place. I know others in Congress are not making border security a top priority. I think we need to. Many overreacted, I think, with pandemic measures that kept people in their homes and drove up opioid use and overdose deaths to record highs, while others were advocating for reasonable reopenings. Some in Congress want to reduce the role of law enforcement in our communities. I think now some are even advocating for designating illegal drug injection sites, free crack pipes, when instead I think we should be focusing on finding ways to fight the root causes of this crisis. We should work to create jobs to sustain strong, supportive families and direct resources towards building robust local communities. But here's where I think we can really work today, and looking forward to today's dialogue. I think we can agree that our communities need resources to fight widespread substance abuse. It doesn't mean just financial resources, but also rebuilding some of the societal support structures that have failed before that can be repaired, in particular strong families, vibrant communities, and healthy lifestyles. And I believe we need to create the conditions that drive purpose in people's lives and keep our communities away from substance abuse. And so, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to the dialogue today. I'll end my long speech, but in particular, I look forward to hearing from solutions from our colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stile, and again, welcome to everybody. We're not going to do formal introductions. Again, this is a roundtable all about dialogue. I'm going to invite all of our guests to do roughly 5 minutes of presentation. I'm not going to be too heavy on the gavel, but we really do want to have a dialogue, ask questions, follow up and stuff, so I might start waving around at about 5 minutes or so just to ask you to wind up. But let's start with, we'll start on this side with Dr. Christensen, one of our colleagues. Ms. Miller is here, apparently a friend of Dr. Christensen, and so we'll so that Ms. Miller can get about her day, we'll start with her introduction of Dr. Christensen.
Thank you, Chairman Hines and Ranking Member Stile. Yes, I am so excited to be here. Good morning to everyone. I want to introduce you to Dr. Matthew Christensen, who serves in West Virginia's Director of the Office of Drug and Control Policy. He is from our hometown, Huntington, and a friend. Dr. Christensen is familiar with West Virginia's battle against opioids and substance use from working on the front lines in primary care and addiction medicine at Marshall Health and serving as the medical director of Ebenezer Medical Outreach, which is a free clinic in Huntington. In addition, Dr. Christensen is an associate professor at Marshall University Joan C. Edwards School of Medicine, equipping and training up the next generation of medical professionals in West Virginia. Dr. Christensen has led efforts to utilize data-driven programming and evidence-based addiction treatment to address drug use across our state. He has implemented joint effort approaches, connecting multiple sectors of society and local leadership to work together, to keep families together, and to engage with individuals who are struggling with substance abuse disorders. Our state has been working hard to combat drug addiction and its effects. I know Dr. Christensen will provide great insight as the Select Committee on Economic Disparity and Fairness and Growth seeks to understand and respond to the rise in substance abuse across America. Thank you so much. Dr. Christensen?
Thank you, Congresswoman Miller. Appreciate that introduction. And thank you, House Select Committee members, for having me today. My name is Dr. Matthew Christensen, and I serve as the Director of the West Virginia Office of Drug Control Policy for the state of West Virginia under Governor Jim Justice. West Virginia has been ground zero for the addiction crisis throughout the past decade. In 2019, West Virginia had the highest per capita overdose death rate of 52.8 per 100,000, according to the CDC. We saw a massive influx of prescription pills. It was well documented from the front pages of our national papers to Netflix to the obituary sections in our local papers across small-town rural West Virginia. And when those prescription pill supplies were shut down, local people suffering went to the illicit market, first to heroin, methamphetamine, and now fentanyl. We responded aggressively as a state. We saw early successes in addressing the addiction epidemic in 2018 and 2019 with the expansion of quick response teams, a massive increase in the number of treatment and recovery beds, more access to evidence-based medications, and knowing that if we build out the right supports for people and their mental health needs, that recovery for individuals, for their communities, and for the state is not only possible, but probable. We know that the default human condition is not one of craving, withdrawal, depression, isolation, and guilt born of addiction, but connection, contribution, collaboration, faith, and hope for a better future born of recovery. And if you spent any time in our great state, and Congresswoman Miller can attest to this, you know darn well that we believe that to our core. When COVID-19 hit, we saw two things happen simultaneously. One, we had to reduce treatment and recovery services to keep people safe from COVID. We moved many services to telehealth. At the same time, the illicit drug market continued its progression towards more potent opioids that were easier to smuggle in smaller packages, such as fentanyl. Those life-saving behavioral health services were disrupted. At the same time, a poison was awaiting our most vulnerable people on the streets. Our office and our administration recognized the damage that this could create early and went to support remote addiction services like apps, websites, and others. We increased naloxone distribution by more than 300% over the previous year and continued to double down on proven evidence-based interventions like medications, treatment programs, recovery support services, emergency department, and corrections interventions, despite the ongoing COVID pandemic. We have been the epicenter, but we are also happy to say that we're seeing progress. The CDC recently reported provisional data that show that even while the national rate of overdose death plateaus, the West Virginia overdose death rate is declining month after month from April through September of 2021, and we expect and are hopeful that that trend will continue. The federal money that has gone to our state in West Virginia has saved lives. In West Virginia, that looks like 38 quick response teams, which are teams that go out and respond after an individual overdoses to engage them in treatment and recovery. It looks like statewide anti-stigma campaigns to educate people that addiction is not a life sentence. It's a treatable condition like other chronic diseases like high blood pressure, diabetes, and depression. And it looks like new intervention programs in emergency departments, jails, prisons, and others to screen and treat the underlying issue, which is addiction. And most importantly, at the end of the day, it looks like families reunited and employees back in the workforce. We're using data in new ways in West Virginia to understand our issues and to predict overdose spikes before they happen so that we're not just responding after the fact and saying, wow, last month was a really bad month, but looking proactively to say what our previous data shows us about what's going to happen next month. We can use that data to notify law enforcement, distribute life-saving naloxone, send out bad batch alerts, and activate our harm reduction programs. But let me be very clear, with all the progress we've made, we are nowhere near done. No overdose deaths are acceptable, and in 2020, West Virginia lost more than 1,336 of our citizens to overdose. Based on our best estimates, those 1,336 people represent about 2% of the people in West Virginia that are living with a severe substance use disorder, meaning that 98% of people in West Virginia with a substance use disorder are either in long-term recovery, many hopefully listening in today, but many are also living in active addiction, struggling with access to care and hope for a better future. We're doing better, as we said, but we have to keep doing better. We didn't get here overnight, and we won't fix this issue overnight, but our success in West Virginia has really been driven by collaboration across the state, driven by leadership of Governor Justice all the way down through our community coalitions and local health departments. Because of that leadership across the state, we've owned this crisis, and we've really owned the solutions. We've been an innovator from day one. We've created a Jobs and Hope program to integrate people living in long-term recovery back into the workforce to help them break down barriers and help them be successful long-term. West Virginians have developed a Handle with Care program to notify teachers if a student has a law enforcement interaction so that teachers can be cognizant of that stressor for the child and break the cycle of trauma. We're looking at analytics and predictive modeling in new ways. We've expanded statewide quick response teams broadly across the state, among many, many others. I'll end by telling you what I tell my patients, which is that addiction is treatable. We have to keep people alive long enough for that treatment to work, and that addiction is treatable not only for those individuals, but for their towns and communities, for our state and our nation, but we have to support the entities that make that possible long enough to allow those treatments to work. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Christensen. I'm told that I interfered with the order, so just in keeping with the informal nature of the roundtable, we're actually going to go to Dr. Pinnell, and then we'll work our way to Mr. Gray and on. So sorry about that, and thank you, Dr. Pinnell.
You're good. Thank you for having me today. My name is Catherine Pannell. I'm a board-certified psychiatrist practicing in Oxford and Madison, Mississippi. I'm also a very passionate advocate for those with mental health and substance abuse disorders. I've been intimately affected by substance abuse, having a father who is in recovery and a father-in-law who lost his battle with substance abuse. This continues to fuel my drive to find solutions to our current mental health and substance abuse crisis. So again, thank you for having me today. Just a very brief background on fentanyl. There are two types of fentanyl, pharmaceutical fentanyl and illicitly manufactured fentanyl. Both are considered synthetic opioids. However, pharmaceutical fentanyl is legally manufactured and regulated. It is prescribed by physicians to treat severe pain, such as after surgery or advanced stage cancer. Illicitly manufactured fentanyl has zero medicinal purpose. It is distributed through illegal drug markets for its heroin-like effect. It is often added to drugs because of its extreme potency, which makes drugs cheaper, more powerful, more addictive, and thus much more dangerous. This is the fentanyl linked to the most recent cases of overdose. Fentanyl is 50 to 100 times stronger than morphine. It is only slightly less deadly than ricin and just as deadly, it's only slightly less deadly than nerve gas and just as deadly as ricin, both of which are considered weapons of mass destruction. An amount equivalent to a grain of salt can cause death. Fentanyl is almost always consumed accidentally. Most do not seek out to use or abuse fentanyl. Fentanyl and other synthetic opioids are efficient and cost-effective for drug producers and traffickers, and often deadly for those who consume them. Unless you overdose in an emergency room, your chances of survival are slim. Even if someone with the opioid reversal med Narcan finds you overdosed and uses it on you, the chances you survive are still not great. Doses that normally reverse opioid overdoses do not work in fentanyl overdoses. It is just too powerful. The synthetic opioids harming Americans are mostly manufactured outside of the U.S. and brought into our country and communities through multiple routes. Fentanyl is wreaking havoc on communities. My own community has been hit hard with fentanyl-related overdose deaths and is one of the reasons why I'm here today. Just recently on Interstate 40, the interstate 1 mile north of my community, a woman was arrested transporting 20 pounds of fentanyl. 20 pounds of fentanyl is enough fentanyl to kill over 4.5 million Americans. I practice in a college town. It has become routine during all my appointments with young adults to educate them about fentanyl. They are not aware that literally one pill can kill. Pills that they think they are just using casually on a night out partying, like Xanax or Adderall, can now be laced with fentanyl, and they will have no clue because the pills look identical to pharmaceutical pills. Many illegal drugs, including counterfeit prescription opioid pills, heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, and ecstasy, can be mixed or laced with fentanyl without a person's knowledge because they would not be able to see, taste, or even smell the fentanyl. But not only have my conversations about fentanyl increased with my patients in my clinic, but I've also had numerous conversations with state lawmakers in the past year about our current fentanyl crisis. And that is exactly what it is, a crisis. In Mississippi, we saw a 70% increase in fentanyl-related overdoses between 2019 and 2020. This has sparked the generation of multiple pieces of legislation this session in Mississippi to help combat this issue. Representatives Bain, Creekmore, and Yancey leading on this, knowing the urgency of intervention. But Mississippi is not unique. The overdose crisis in the U.S. claims more lives each year than firearms, suicide, homicides, or motor vehicle crashes combined. This is a nationwide issue that is occurring not only during an opioid epidemic, but during a COVID pandemic and a mental health crisis. Since the beginning of the opioid epidemic in 1999, drug overdoses have killed over 1 million Americans. The COVID pandemic has caused a staggering increase in overdose deaths. Between April 2019 and April 2020, we saw the overdose deaths reach 100,000. 64% of these overdose deaths were secondary to fentanyl, most between the ages of 18 and 45. But drugs do more than just cause death and losses to communities, which is horrible enough in itself, but they also harm our national economy. In 2018, the cost of overdose fatalities was somewhere around $696 billion. It's safe to assume that this number has increased. Some speculate now that it's closer to $1 trillion. It is projected that without drastic intervention, we will see over 1.2 million deaths by 2029. But why such a grim forecast? The pandemic has affected every aspect of a human's life, from health, job security, economic stability, and beyond. Over the past 2 years, we have seen the COVID pandemic worsen mental health conditions such as anxiety, depression, and substance abuse disorders. There is no disputing that mental illness and substance abuse go hand in hand. Often, substances are used to self-medicate. At the height of the pandemic, 1 in 10 Americans either started or increased their substance abuse. This coincided with the increase in mental illness during the pandemic. The Mental Health America's online screening program, taken by 2 million Americans, revealed that 75% scored positive or with moderate severe symptoms of a mental health issue. 68% of these patients had never been diagnosed with a mental health disorder prior to COVID-19. And this is exactly consistent with what I'm seeing in my clinics as well. But this has just not affected adults. Our children have been greatly affected as well. The 2021 Surgeon General's Advisory on Youth Mental Health showed that as of June of last year, 140,000 children have lost a parent or caregiver due to COVID-19. ER visits, psychiatric hospitalizations, and suicides have all dramatically increased. In fact, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and the American Academy of Pediatrics declared a national emergency in children's mental health in October of 2021. Just yesterday, as I was
Doctor,
boarding
I'm sorry,
my...
we're approaching 7 minutes, so
Yeah.
let me ask you to just kind of wind up if you would, and we'll get into the dialogue.
Sure. Just yesterday, as I was boarding my plane, I learned of an 11-year-old boy just in the town south of me who committed suicide. Last week, it was a teen who jumped to their death in our capital city. We hope that our youth go on to become successful adults, but without proper mental health treatment and early intervention, they have increased risk of becoming victims of substance use. Sadly, targeting the supply of synthetic opioids like fentanyl has proven difficult. However, reducing the demand for synthetic opioids through early childhood mental health and substance abuse education, community education about fentanyl, increased access to treatment, coverage parity, and strengthen our drug courts is a tangible goal that would save hundreds of thousands of lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Mr. Gray, you came in a little bit late. We're keeping it pretty informal, but we're trying to shoot for about 5 minutes. But we're grateful for your presence here, and I think I speak for the committee when I say we're just so stunned by people who can turn tragedy into really positive things. So thanks for being with us today.
Oh, I thank you very much. Thank you for that sentiment. Chairman Hines and distinguished members, I thank you for your invitation to address the 117th Congress to a crisis that has now plagued 6 to 8 sessions of this body. My name is Michael Gray, and I represent the Octus Foundation and the Fentanyl Awareness Coalition. We have 22,000 active members and growing hundreds by each day whose children are indeed the forgotten victims of this crisis. My wife, Nancy, and I lost our daughter to acute fentanyl toxicity in 2018. I'm here to remind you that the death toll from illicit drugs has surpassed 100,000 Americans for the first time in history this year. That is a 300% increase for the 10 years since 2012. But you all know that, don't you? That the CDC numbers are predictably underreported, but you likely know that as well. And that biasing them upward by more than 50% is non-controversial. This means that the true opioid crisis has now become a 747 load of young people crashing each day, 365 days a year, for several years with no end in sight. But this you all know, even if you don't put it in those grisly aviation terms. What I'm primarily here to tell you is what you don't know, or at least aren't legislating to. I'm here to prove that the dramatic increase in death, that 747, which will be upgraded to something bigger soon, was predictable, and that it's pulling into its vortex the likes of those kids looking up at you from that laminated card I've placed before you. These are just 3 of the now millions of young people who have passed away in the so-called opioid crisis. Moreover, the average age of death is dropping precipitously from 26 in 2015 to getting under 20 by today, 20 years old. I say so-called because most people in our country, including almost every expert you'll hear from, other than myself and a few others, have a profound misunderstanding of the crisis as it exists today that we call fentanyl. That misunderstanding is why we sit here as deer in headlights watching the crisis unfold in the worst possible manner it could. It simply couldn't be worse. And we're powerless to do anything about it. The children on that laminated card were not suffering substance use disorder. They weren't chronic drug users or users at all. All of that changed suddenly in 2013. And death now comes to those with no behavioral indicators, no patterns of use or abuse to signal the threat. We are way behind the curve of that change. On the back of the laminated card is a graphic which tells the whole story of our failure as a nation on one side. I look forward to explaining that graphic and some other key concepts during this roundtable. I am further here to tell you that our failure to curb the death toll was perfectly predictable when I predicted it 4 years ago and set out on this journey to expose the true nature of the problem and the new solutions needed. A change happened and we didn't react to it. It's high time we do. I speak of this change as a paradigm shift. Working in the scientific field, I do not use this term lightly. I mean it as it was meant by the man who coined the term, Stanford physicist Thomas Kuhn. The scientist is ever vigilant for paradigm shifts because when they happen, quote, the dominant paradigm is rendered incompatible with new phenomena, facilitating the need for adoption of a new theory or paradigm, unquote. In other words, failure when operating to an obsolete paradigm is one of life's few guarantees. Yet, we sit here today, several years and 3 Congresses post-paradigm shift, wondering why we can't put a dent in this exploding crisis. Well, Thomas Kuhn foretold that answer in 1962, and I've been trying to get our country to get aligned with the new paradigm for 4 years. Do you see the logic in what I'm saying? Let's consider the problem in a sort of a syllogism, if you will. Premise: a paradigm shift occurs, ushering in a death curve orders of magnitude greater than the old paradigm. Premise: we continue to push all solutions and aim all resources at the old, stable paradigm. Conclusion: the unaddressed new paradigm expands dramatically, sending the manifest problem off the rails, and our nation sits bewildered and wondering what happened. Finally, I'm here to tell you that we can indeed put a dent in this crisis, and much more. If only we do 2 things. 1, recognize the paradigm shift which has evaded our national consciousness, and 2, make the minimal adjustments needed to the tens of billions of dollars of funding for this crisis to put some resources, and I say some because there are presently none, to place some of our resources on the growing part of this problem, which remains untouched as it expands horrifically. I'll tease you a bit further. The new paradigm I speak of is much more solvable than the old one. It's low-hanging fruit for the picking. Ladies and gentlemen, and especially for Mrs. Angie Craig, Jay Robinson, one of the most successful coaches in American NCAA history, wrestling coach, committed to help me with something once. He gave me a personal number and, turning back to look at me as he walked away, pointed at me and said, "If you don't call, it's on you." I conclude to you by saying this to this distinguished panel, sans pointing. You have the man with the answers to your worst national problem sitting before you today. If you don't call me, if you don't take our perspective and make it policy, it's on you. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Gray. And Dr. Grooms, you've got plus or minus 5 minutes.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you, Chair Himes, and distinguished members of the Select Committee for inviting me to speak today. My name is Javée Grooms. I'm an assistant professor of economics and a fellow at the Center for Race and Wealth at Howard University, and I'm a visiting scholar at the Sol Price Public Policy School at the University of Southern California. I'm an applied microeconomist with an expertise that lies at the intersection of public economics, health economics, and poverty and inequality. Today, I'm going to focus on 3 topics: economics and substance use disorders, co-occurrence of substance use disorders, and mental health and disparities. At its core, health is a determinant in the United States' ability to produce and meet the needs of its citizens. We are all constrained by time, and time spent being ill inhibits our ability to use this precious resource to be productive. At a fundamental level, individuals with a substance use disorder report lower wages and higher unemployment. But it extends beyond labor market conditions. In general, substance use is associated with stress on the criminal system, foster care system, and the healthcare system, to name a few. As a result, resources are diverted from creating opportunities to treating ailments. For some Americans, substance use disorders are preceded by an employment crisis. As Dr. Ann Case and Dr. Angus Deaton described in their Deaths of Despair research, hopelessness and helplessness lead Americans to counterproductive behavior, to escape reality of economic hardships faced by the disappearance of the working class. As Americans faced economic hardships, simultaneously the medical industry flooded the market with pain medication, creating a perfect storm. While Case and Deaton spoke about the white working class, we would be remiss to think this is purely a problem that white America faces. The opioid epidemic is the side effect of a more significant problem. Thus, efforts to address it at the point of prescription have not been as promising in curbing overdose deaths as previously thought. Some of the underlying circumstances which contributed to the current drug epidemic has impacted other subsets of the population as well. To help illustrate this, I want to take a moment to echo the sentiments of Dr. Derek Hamilton, who spoke to the committee on January 20th of this year. Quoting him, "Over the last half century, essentially all of our nation's productivity gains have gone to the elite and upper middle class, while effectively flatlining real worker wages for everyone else." Pulling from the Economic Policies Institute that reported, from 1980 to 2020, on average, productivity in the US increased 61.8%, while wages merely increased 11.7%. That's a far cry from the 3 decades prior, where productivity and compensation almost matched 1-to-1. While economic stressors could trigger substance use, this dependency could also be influenced by an injury, traumatic event, or other mental health conditions. According to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, in 2018, approximately 20.3 million Americans had a substance use disorder. 9.2 of them also had a co-occurring mental health condition. Substance use disorders and mental health are often intertwined, but the directionality is less clear. As reported by the National Institute of Drug Abuse, roughly half of all individuals who suffer from a mental health condition will suffer a substance use disorder at some point in their life, and vice versa. Thus, it is imperative that when we discuss the devastating impacts of substance use, we also discuss it in conjunction with mental health. A critical component of treating substance use disorders and other mental health conditions is adequate health insurance. The Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act and the Essential Health Benefits of the Affordable Care Act impose standards for mental health treatment and set a federal minimum standard for qualified health plans. In addition, the expansion of Medicaid included childless adults who fell below 138% of the federal poverty line. Medicaid is the largest payer for mental health services in the United States, and research has illustrated the substantial and quantifiable impact of Medicaid expansion on substance use treatment. In ongoing research with Dr. Alberto Ortega, we find states which expanded Medicaid were associated with significant increases in substance use treatment admissions by Medicaid beneficiaries relative to states that did not expand Medicaid. At the disaggregated level, this result holds for Black, Indigenous Americans, and white admissions to treatment facilities. Recent work by Dr. Jacoby further demonstrates the importance of health insurance and access to medical care. In her study, she found that young men with a mental health diagnosis who were no longer Medicaid eligible were 14% more likely to be incarcerated within 2 years relative to their matched comparison group. This percentage grew to 21% by their 21st birthday. Health insurance is critical for continued care of substance use disorder and mental health. Whereas most states have expanded Medicaid to help provide health insurance for those individuals who otherwise cannot access coverage, there are still more than 2 million Americans who fall into the coverage gap. They primarily live in the southern states and are disproportionately Black and other racial and ethnic minorities. Moving along to my last topic, disparities. As some have mentioned, provisional counts for drug overdose deaths this last year was over 100,000. While more white lives are lost from the drug overdose deaths than any other race or ethnicity, the number of Black drug overdose deaths steadily climbed over the last decade. White drug overdose deaths increased by 87% from 2012 to 2019. Black drug overdose deaths increased by 361%, and Hispanic overdose deaths increased by 206% during that same time period. According to the Pew Research Center, the age-adjusted drug overdose death rate is the highest among Black men at 54.1 per 100,000 Americans, followed by Indigenous Americans. Co-authored paper published in the Review of Black Political Economy investigated reported mental health distress at the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. We found that at nearly every level of employment, Black respondents reported elevated levels of mental health distress relative to white respondents. That is to suggest economic stressors are not a right only afforded to some Americans.
Dr.
Well, we
Grimm,
must-
we're coming on 7 minutes, so I'm going to ask you.
Okay, I'm gonna conclude.
Thank you.
As we strive to alleviate the economic and social burden legal and illegal substances place on our society, it is vital that we engage stakeholders at the community level. Understanding that the lack of economic prosperity can be a driving force in the uptick of substance use, it is paramount that we acknowledge the heterogeneity that exists across our landscape, from the Appalachian regions to urban, racially, and ethnically diverse communities. Unfortunately, there's no magic pill that will alleviate the devastation that we are currently facing. It'll take government officials empowering local stakeholders to help create a framework from which local communities can support and provide wraparound services for their residents to help ensure economic and social stability. As we continue to grapple with the effects of the prior and the current drug epidemic, I urge us to avoid moral panic and focus the discussion addressing the mental health distress nationwide by way of access to health care and economic opportunities. This work needs to be done even in places where warning bells are not being set off to help prevent the next wave of distress. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Grooms. Dr. Prado, you're recognized for plus or minus 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Himes, and thank you, Ranking Member Stile and members of the Select Committee. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm Willie Prado. I'm Professor of Nursing and Health Studies and Public Health Sciences at the University of Miami. Substance use, I want to start off by saying that substance use is not an individual public health problem. It's a public health problem, public health crisis that's part of families, part of communities. Individuals are embedded within families, and families are embedded within communities. And so it's really important to target family level and community level factors so that we prevent and treat substance abuse. Context is particularly important, and it's particularly important when we talk about both treatment, which we have been talking about this morning, but also prevention. My work focuses on prevention because I work with youth so that we can avoid the problem. So it's really more of a proactive approach to substance use as opposed to a reactive approach when it's perhaps a little too late. The focus of my work and my colleagues is on developing and evaluating prevention programs and taking those prevention programs to scale, whether it's to embed them within school systems, within primary care settings, within communities. Why is prevention important, and why should it be the focus instead of treatment? One, it's much more cost-effective, and the effects of prevention are both short-term and long-term. For adolescents, those adolescents in the 12th grade, 40% of those adolescents have already tried an illicit drug use. In the 8th grade, 1 in 6 eighth graders have tried an illicit drug use. Let's think about that, where 1 in 6 of our 13 or 14-year-olds have already experimented and have tried an illicit drug use, many of which are going to continue to use drugs and use harder core drugs over time. Their prevention programs have shown to be quite effective and to be quite cost-effective. Prevention programs such as family training programs, parenting training programs that give the parents the tool to really help their adolescents develop healthy, to effectively communicate with their youth, to effectively work with their youth to be able to resist peer pressure. Programs that focus on prevention, as I mentioned, tend to have long-term effects, and they tend to have an impact on other outcomes, as was just saying by my colleague, the fact that mental health and drug use are really concurrent problems. And it's unclear which one comes first, but these prevention programs often have an impact not only on substance use, which is the target of the prevention program, but it also has an impact on other outcomes, including but not limited to mental health. My work has focused mostly on Hispanic white and Hispanic Black youth and their family members, and we have shown very strong effects on drug use in this population. We've observed in multiple randomized clinical trials reductions in drug use of 20 to 40% in any given study. We've taken these programs and embedded them in communities, and they're currently being supported by state funding or community funding in some states, including but not limited to Pennsylvania, New York, and Rhode Island. We have also implemented this program and other programs broadly, including but not limited to Chile, which I'm happy to speak to you a little bit more about. In summary, I want to say the importance of investing early on, investing in our youth, in our children, investing in prevention programs that are evidence-based. Oftentimes, we invest in programs that are embedded within schools that have no rigorous evidence, and we spend millions, if not billions of dollars on these programs without any evidence, where really we should be investing programs that do have the evidence base. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Prado, and thank you, everybody, for kicking us off. I'm going to ask Mr. Donalds to kick off the questions, but I do want to preview one question that I'll put to start with the practitioners, with Dr. Christensen and Dr. Pennell. And my question, on this committee, I'm always hungry for solutions, specific solutions, right? And the federal government sends a lot of money to states, to educational institutions, and sometimes we don't have visibility into what's working and what's not working. So the question I'm going to preview for you is, what programs can we hold up that are actually having a good effect and are a good use of federal resources? So just to preview that, but let's ask Mr. Donalds to kick off the questions. And by the way, the point here is dialogue, so let's try to achieve that.
Thank you, Chairman. To the panel, thanks for coming. I think this might be a first in Congress in the 117th where all the witnesses are in the room, so thanks for being here. No, seriously, I really do appreciate it, and also, in spite of what we're talking about, this is actually a very important topic, like everybody understands. I have 3 sons. They're 18, 14, and 10. The dialogue I've had with my 18-year-old son that I've also now had with my 14-year-old son is actually pretty straightforward. And I tell my sons, like, listen, I do not want you using drugs. Do not use drugs. But please, if you ever listen to anything I tell you, please do not use crack cocaine. Please do not use heroin. And please do not use methamphetamines. I was like, I don't want you using drugs. This is important. But what I know is those 3 drugs, they change your life forever or will end your life. After this discussion, obviously, I'm going to have to add fentanyl to the mix, and it's really unfortunate. So the first thing, and this can be open from the panel. The first thing I want to know is, like, right now, what's current typical street value of fentanyl in the United States? Anybody know that?
Well, to speak to what was mentioned.
Yeah.
To speak to what was mentioned earlier, not a lot of people necessarily buy fentanyl, but it's included in cocaine. It's included in other drugs.
Okay. Well, and that's the part I just kind of want to for the committee and for as we shape policy, try to look at what potential policy is, it's important to kind of understand like what are the real dynamics. Sometimes up here we talk about things from a federal policy level, not understanding the actual dynamics on the ground. Like is somebody getting a nickel bag, is somebody getting a dime bag? But if you're lacing it in other product and in other drugs, then that changes the dynamics of what we're speaking about. I mean, my second real question is like, what are the traffic routes of how fentanyl overall is getting into the United States? Obviously, Dr. Panel, you mentioned that it's obviously the problem is not pharmaceutical grade fentanyl, it's illegal manufacturing of fentanyl. So, I mean, do we have a problem in the United States with manufacturing houses in the United States, or is this outside the United States where the vast majority is being manufactured?
Mr. Donalds, may I take that question?
Sure, Mr. Gray, yeah, sure, go ahead.
So, because I think I can touch both your questions with one answer. First of all, how the fentanyl gets here. So it started, and I refer to a paradigm shift. The paradigm shift occurred when fentanyl was very suddenly dropped on our country in the year 2013.
Mr. Gray, real quick, I don't want to cut you off, but I mean, in the essence of time, and we're trying to keep
Yeah, sure.
Like just
This will take
try to
about,
focus
yeah,
it.
this will take no time.
Sure, focus.
So it started with China in 2013.
All right.
And then we got this fentanyl coming from basically scientists an ocean away. And it was a problem. And it was basically mimicking powdered heroin, diacetylmorphine.
Right.
Okay? So that's what it was doing for years. And the street value to this day is still more or less ostensibly the value of heroin on the street. But now, as everyone's talking about, it's coming into these other drugs, right?
Okay.
The big change, that was the paradigm shift. But the big change was when we shut down the fentanyl manufacturing in China through very good negotiations with China. The unintended consequence was all that manufacturing, the bulk of it got shifted to Mexico.
Okay.
And now we've got Mexican drug lords making it who are expert drug traffickers. They're not nerdy scientists an ocean away. They're expert drug traffickers on our back door. So they had this bright idea, why sell powdered heroin to 3 million heroin addicts in America when I can press it into all kinds of pills and sell it to 30 million kids in America who abuse drugs one time here and there at a party? That's where the death curve came in. So in answer to both your questions, that's how the process comes. So right now, it's almost all coming from Mexico. The precursor comes from China, the piperidine precursor, and it's made in Mexico and pushed through the border because these people know how to get it through the border, they know how to distribute it to our streets, and they know how to market to kids. The Chinese never knew how to do any of that.
All right, good question. Dr. Pennell, Dr. Christensen, I know you raised your hands. You wanted to add to anything that Mr. Gray said?
No, I mean, he did explain it well. I mean, to just sum it up easily, I mean, this is not usually manufactured in the U.S. It's not usually manufactured in our communities. A few will use pill presses to do it, but that's minimal. It is coming in from other sources like Mexico and the precursors in China. That's why I said it's very difficult to reduce the supply of synthetic fentanyl, and that's why we need to really focus our intervention on the demand for fentanyl.
Okay, Dr. Christian, you want to add to that? And Dr. Groves, you can also chime in if you want to add to that as well.
The only thing I have to add is that uniquely to our state of West Virginia, we find that it generally comes from larger cities in the Midwest. So as just to add another level to that, it seems to come up through some of the bigger cities and then come down to our more rural state of West Virginia. So it is coming from abroad and then comes up through some of those larger urban areas, then over to us.
I did want to add, I wanted to echo what Mr. Gray said. I completely agree with him. A lot of overdose deaths are not necessarily individuals that have a substance use disorder, right? You should tell your sons, I have 2 sons, they can't do any street drugs. Street drugs are laced with fentanyl. We see an uptick in overdose deaths.
Right.
I focus on substance use because I'm also interested in the existing overdose, the existing substance use that existed from decades before, right? Crack cocaine. We still see a large number of individuals that suffer from substance use disorder that are becoming older. But to echo what Mr. Gray said is yes, it's not all these overdose deaths are associated with substance use disorder.
Okay. Chairman, how am I on time? Are we good or? Okay, okay. Last 2 things I want to touch, and I know Dr. Prado and Dr. Grooms, you guys touched on this. Dr. Pennell, you touched on this as well. Treatment programs, prevention programs. I know that, obviously in the United States, since the onset of the war on drugs, we've been in a mode of not only just going after drug traffickers and dealers, but also trying to deal with prevention programs. What do you guys see in terms of the prevention programs, in some respects, the prevention programs more than the treatment programs that seem to be the most effective with young people in schools. And you guys can kind of all get at that. I don't want to, Dr. Prado, I'll start with you. And we can go.
Sure, I'm happy to start. Thank you, Mr. Donalds. Before I respond to this one, if I may, you made a comment about speaking to your children about not using drugs. And there are families where the family context isn't supportive, and the communication between the family members is not where it should be to have some of those difficult conversations. And there is some research, actually a significant amount of research, that for those types of families, it's a possibility that the effects of telling the youth not to engage in substances may cause some iatrogenic effects. It may actually encourage the youth to use drugs.
Sorry, I just want to get up with the jargon. I just
No,
want
I apologize. That's why
it's okay. I just want to make sure I got it. But go ahead.
And I think your question is a great one about those prevention programs that are most effective. I do want to point that there's a number of registries that contain the list of the most promising and evidence-based prevention programs. For example, the CDC has the DEBI programs, which are diffusion of evidence-based programs, that really classify those prevention programs that have been most effective in preventing sexual risks and including substance use. SAMHSA, although that has been taken down over the past couple of years, but SAMHSA used to have a registry of a national registry for evidence-based prevention programs that really rated the quality of each of the intervention programs based on the existing literature and whether those prevention programs have been evaluated or not. The third registry that I'll make a reference to is Blueprints. Blueprints is considered one of the most important registries of effective prevention and treatment programs, mostly for adolescents, although not exclusively. So it really has a list of those prevention programs that are most effective. Family programs are very, very efficacious and very effective in reducing drug use and concurrent conditions. In part, because it gives the parents are the change agent of that kid's behavior, and it gives the parents the tools to be able to prevent some of the use or some of the escalation, in addition to the fact that because parents have these tools, they can use these tools with all of the children in the household and beyond. So they tend to be very, very cost effective, and there's a significant amount of literature that shows that parenting training programs' effects actually grow over time, as opposed to some of the other programs, including individual programs, where the effect is strongest while the prevention program is being delivered, but as soon as we stop delivering the prevention program, the effects tend to go away or diminish over time. With the family programs, the effects actually continue to grow over the period of time.
Hey, real quick, guys, and I know I kind of threw that out to all the doctors, but I'm a kind of pull it back and hand it back to the chairman. The last point I really want to make, and I mean, Mr. Gray, you highlighted it as well as Dr. Pinnell, and really the entire panel did. Obviously, we have a real situation with fentanyl manufacturing in Mexico. When I was down at the border, the last time I was there, in the McAllen section, actually, Border Patrol, was very explicit in the fact that the current enforcement measures on the southern border, where the asylum process is essentially wide open, has empowered the drug cartels to, frankly, move children across the border, in some respects to intercept Border Patrol agents for the processing of asylum claims. And then while Border Patrol is being occupied, then the drug cartels are moving fentanyl across the border and other drugs. And it's without question in the United States that fentanyl trafficking is up massively the last 15 months in our country. I, for one, am actually glad that the president actually talked about securing the border. I think it's incumbent, not only for this conversation, but so many others, that we do that immediately, because this product, based upon all of your testimony, is devastating to all communities in the United States. Mr. Chairman, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead. Go
Just
ahead.
have a few seconds to address Mr. Donalds. Mr. Donalds, if I might give you some personal advice on talking about your kids, a little insight. The one thing this fentanyl does for us, because it's being put into every kind of drug, an Adderall pill isn't safe, cocaine isn't safe, a Vicodin pill isn't safe, it sort of releases you as a parent from that moralizing conversation. It's not a moral conversation anymore. You don't have to say to your boys, don't do drugs because you'll be bad, or you'll get kicked out of school, or your life will be ruined, and you'll be a bad guy. You can say, you won't come home Friday night, and I love you, and I want you home Friday night. That's it. Full conversation. No moralizing. As a parent, you're freed of that whole moral discussion. It's deadly. Don't do it, or you won't come home, and I love you, and I want you home.
I appreciate that, Mr. Gray. My sons know I don't do a lot of moralizing. I'm actually pretty direct. They know that about me. But no, I appreciate your comments. It is well received. And I know that's something I'll definitely be taking back home without question. Thank you.
So, Dr. Pennell and Dr. Christensen, this actually is a good transition from where Mr. Donalds was. Let me intercede. We're a real quick question, though, because I do want to come back to both of you on to hold up some specific programs that you think are really making a difference. But Dr. Prado, you said something really interesting, which is that there was a SAMHSA registry, and then you said it doesn't exist anymore. Was that effective? And if so, why doesn't it exist anymore, and should we bring it back?
Yeah, so it was taken down from the SAMHSA website during the last administration. And in my opinion, yes, it should be brought back up. 'Cause
Was there I mean, you highlighted this as an effective thing. Why was it taken down?
I'm not sure, other than I know it was taken down by about 4 years ago now.
Okay, but it was about doing exactly what I'm doing here, which is holding up the effectiveness of particular programs.
Absolutely. And so it had a long list of 100+ prevention and treatment programs that had been evaluated and successfully implemented. And there was a significant amount of evidence behind those programs. And it was really a great place for all of us in society to take a look at which programs are effective and which ones should be adopted into different settings.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. That's a very tangible thing that the committee will look into, probably working with the Committee on Energy and Commerce. Dr. Christensen, Dr. Pennell, what programs would have been highly rated on that SAMHSA list?
Well, I know in Mississippi, we have what are called drug courts, and they have been highly successful. And in Mississippi, we actually have legislation to fund those more appropriately because they have shown so much success. And these are basically courts where patients or people that have substance abuse disorders can go through this process of attending court appearances. They have regular drug tests. They get social services, and which helps plug them in with employment. Community service, and it basically gives them an opportunity to get clean, stay clean, be educated, be productive in society versus going into jail. And it has proven to be quite successful, and I think it would be huge to pay more attention to that, give more funding to that in the states to strengthen those drug courts, because it is one of the few things that we have shown that actually has proved successful.
So what you're describing here sounds like the migration away from a more law enforcement to a more public health approach to people.
Well, yeah, because we're seeing with synthetic opioids, because as we've seen, it's coming in from other places. It's been very hard to stop the supply because of the darknet, internet, and just because it's coming from other places. So if you pay more attention and give more intervention and focus towards reducing the demand for the drugs, the opiates, but also helping those that are actually actively seeking treatment through drug court intervention or mental health parity, substance abuse treatment parity, that's where you can actually show tangible effects.
Thank you. Dr. Christensen?
When I think about this question, I try to divide it up into segments, because there's multiple areas of intervention that we use in West Virginia to look at people across the treatment spectrum and across the care continuum. So as Dr. Prado is discussing, that there's a multitude of evidence-based prevention programs, and generally what we understand about effective prevention is that it's not about telling kids that drugs are bad. It's about building resiliency, building skill sets, building role models for those students, so that we're addressing the underlying reasons that people use drugs in the first place, not just the drugs themselves as a symptom of their underlying either anxiety or other things that they're struggling with as kids, and all kids struggle with something. So prevention is one that we are doubling down on in our schools and our public school systems. The second that I think about is keeping people alive, and there are multiple evidence-based programs that we use in West Virginia to keep people alive if they're not ready to stop using. And so evidence-based harm reduction services like naloxone distribution has been something we've been incredibly successful with in West Virginia, and getting it out to very high-risk populations. So these are people that are experiencing homelessness, people in correctional settings, people in our state hospitals that are oftentimes struggling with other mental health disorders as well as their substance use disorder. Naloxone just is a stopgap. It's not a fix. It's not treatment. But it gets someone the opportunity to get into treatment. We do struggle a bit with some of the issues around naloxone. Is currently a prescription medicine, and it has essentially no side effects if someone is not suffering from an overdose. It has less side effects than Benadryl and Tylenol, as far as I'm concerned, and should be made as broadly available as possible, up to and including being made over the counter. We use quite a bit of SOAR funding and mental health block grant and substance abuse block grant funding that comes through SAMHSA for many of those programs. The next thing that we look at is breaking down barriers to treatment and evidence-based programs to get people into treatment. I mentioned quick response teams, which are teams that go out and respond shortly after someone has an overdose, which is, especially if it's a first-time overdose, is an incredibly scary event. Someone is right up at the brink of death and wakes up with someone EMS and strangers in their house looking over them. Those are opportunities for us to get those individuals into treatment. That they're very early programs. We don't have the evidence base to say that they don't meet some of the federal standards for being an evidence-based program yet, but I'm confident that they will. We also have law enforcement-assisted diversion programs, similar to the drug courts that Dr. Pennell was mentioning, where a law enforcement officer can at their discretion, can divert someone out of the correctional system and out of arrest into an evidence-based treatment program. And these would be treatment programs that are on the Academy of Sciences of Addiction Medicine level of the scale for appropriate addiction treatment. Buprenorphine Access, which is otherwise known as, their brand names of Suboxone or Sublocade or Subutex, and the expansion of buprenorphine access in West Virginia has been incredibly successful. It's a medication that blocks the effects of fentanyl. So if someone takes the medication and then they use fentanyl on top, they generally don't feel the effects, and it prevents them from having some of the toxic effects of those more potent opioids. And then we support people in long-term recovery. So we are building out networks of recovery community organizations, as well as bringing our recovery residences, which are sober living homes, up to a minimum level of standards so that they're providing appropriate services for our citizens.
Thank you. I've got Dr. Potter, let me go to the ranking member, but I've got a few other questions too, so we'll come back around.
Appreciate it, Mr. Chairman. I think this is a great conversation. I think the dialogue, I'm just going to pick up where you left off. I think it's going to be this in a similar light. One of my concerns as we look at substance abuse is, are we fighting the old war? And I think that's what you were talking about, Mr. Gray, right? There's this paradigm shift that we went from drugs where people were inserting or getting into drug use for reasons now, they're slightly different. Let me rephrase that. The implications of drug use are different today than they were previously because of the introduction of illicit fentanyl. And as we look at prevention programs that had evidence-based success with the drugs prior to the significant introduction of illicit fentanyl, are we seeing those same successes now with the introduction of illicit fentanyl? And in particular, as you think about many of the drugs that individuals are engaging from streets are being laced with this illicit fentanyl that are being incredibly dangerous. So I'll give you a personal example for sake of discussion. I held a roundtable in Racine, Wisconsin, in southeast Wisconsin, and where I live. Just in this one county, 68 people died from an overdose death from illicit fentanyl last year. One county in the United States, but it's representative of the 64,000 Americans that died over the 12-month period recently. And so what I would love is just to kind of open it up to the panel about, are we using the intervention that we've used historically? Do we need to make a change to address the fact that there is this paradigm shift to now having many of our drugs being laced with illicit fentanyl? I'll start with you, Ms. Grooms, or Dr. Grooms. I'm going to go to Mr. Gray, and we'll continue on.
Thank you for that. I agree with Mr. Gray. There's a paradigm shift, but I want to caution us there is two different issues going on when we talk about substance use. There's substance use disorders, which can be a long-term medical ailment, which can lead to overdose deaths, right? There's one issue where treatment that Dr. Christensen mentioned is really important and urgent, and having access to those medical-assisted treatment facilities are really important. And then we have this new scenario that's happening that has been spurred on by fentanyl, which are drug overdose deaths without dependency, right? So I think it's really important that when we think about this, we think about two separate issues that sometimes the treatment can overlap, but sometimes they may have very distinct treatment plans to address them.
Thank you. Mr. Gray?
May I, this is really the whole reason I'm here, Mr. Steele. So let me just say, if you look at the charts that I gave you, and you look at that gray area, that's people without substance use disorder. I'm here to tell you that I have data that shows, and the people on this panel can agree or disagree, that shows that addiction rates have been constant in this country for like 50 years, and they continue to be constant. That growth and death you're seeing is exactly this other problem. And I want to go back. Before you corrected yourself, you were correct first, before you corrected yourself, when you said, are there different reasons for using? And then you said, let me correct that, and are there different implications of the using? No, the reasons are the really important part. You build a new treatment center. You bring out a new medically assisted treatment. You use all of the prevention programs mentioned so far. It doesn't touch my daughter or the 22,000 people in my organization who all lost a child who wasn't under a substance use disorder. You see, my prevention program, the only one that I see that's going to help our constituency, which, by the way, is, I argue, more than half and the entire growth. And the only thing that's going to help is to get in that moment. I don't care what happened to my constituents when they were 6 years old or 12 years old, 15 years old, or 2 weeks ago. I need to be in that moment when they take one Xanax pill at a party because their friend's doing it. That's not a psychologically based reason to go into substance abuse. That's not addictive behavior. That's a kid being a kid and getting killed for it. And I've got 22,000 members who've suffered this. So that's what I want to make sure, and I applaud Dr. Grooms for bringing that out. These are separate problems. And I'm telling you that the growth and death is the one that we're not touching.
Mr. Prouder, do you want to comment on that?
Yes, I want to go back to something Dr. Christensen said, because I think it was a very good point about intervening along the continuum, from primary prevention all the way to treatment. Because there's different intervention target points, and we really have to be able to do all of the above. And I also think that we have to think from a developmental lens, where we are targeting our elementary school children, our middle school children, our young adult, and our adults. So it's really important to think about targeting programs, effective programs, across the continuum and across the lifespan.
Cognizant of the time, I'll yield back to you, Mr. Chairman. I'll let you direct.
Yeah, I did want to follow up because obviously I want to kind of focus in on the lacing aspects of fentanyl. I mean, my real question, this is much more about potency levels. I mean, is really the issue, and again, I get it, when a child dies or anybody dies, this is tragic. But what in particular have we seen in data is the actual, how am I trying to say this? Is the potency effect of using fentanyl to lace with other drugs? Is it the fact that the mixing is just too high, the content level is too high? I don't know if you guys kind of get where I'm going with this. Like, I guess I'm trying to understand that because, like, obviously from a federal perspective, I think obviously there's stuff that we need to be doing up here about this. This is without question. But I'm just really trying to ascertain and put in the scope where Congress kind of needs to go with this. I don't know if you guys can speak to that. Anybody, really?
Yeah, so as far as the potency is concerned, Ms. Donalds, so let me explain very briefly how fentanyl should be dosed. If you take a sugar cube, that's a gram. If you divide it by 1,000, that's a milligram. And that's about where diacetylmorphine or heroin would dose. Divide it again by 1,000, and that's a microgram. And that's where fentanyl doses. I think it was Dr. Pinello mentioned before, we're talking about a grain of salt being a dose. Well, when you give that to a drug trafficker to mix with baby formula, it's hopeless that they're going to mix it properly. That's the problem you've got. So fentanyl, when mixed by a pharmaceutical engineer, we have people called blending engineers. They have PhDs in physics, and they use $3 million mixing chambers with spectrometers on them to mix drugs like that. Fentanyl is an extremely difficult drug to mix and to dose properly. So when they start mixing it into stuff, it's some drug trafficker with a bullet blender. Who knows what you're getting? Every dose will have lethality. I've been accepted in 2 courts as expert witness. My expert testimony is, if you're selling fentanyl, the data says you're killing people. You can't hide behind any excuse that, well, I don't know, I just sold a drug and they took too much and died, they overdosed. I am an expert witness accepted in court to say, statistically speaking, if you traffic fentanyl, people are dying and you know it.
Thank you, Dr.
Because of that.
Thank you, Ms. Wade. Dr. Pinnell, you were saying in your testimony earlier, you were listing the causes of deaths of Americans 18 to 45. Fentanyl overdose are now more than, what were the other deaths combined? Could you go back into your testimony on that? Because I was trying to catch it and then you moved on, and I just want to make sure I have it for the record.
Yeah, it was motor vehicle accidents. Trying to find it actually in here now. Yeah, firearm, suicide, homicide, and motor vehicle crashes combined.
Ooh, okay. All right. I mean, I'm good, Mr. I just want to thank you all for being here, honestly, and thank you for your time, and thank you for your professionalism on this issue. Obviously, this is the Economic and Disparity Task Force, and I don't want to speak for the chairman or the ranking member, but I think that, if this issue, if it's not addressed appropriately, it's going to have devastating economic consequences for a lot of communities, especially communities where, look, it's all through America. There's not a specific area of the country that deals with illicit drug use any more or less than another, but it's without question, especially with, I guess it appears how cheap fentanyl production is becoming. It's going to have devastating impacts for our economy in all segments of America going forward. So I really want to thank you all for being here.
So I've got a couple more questions. I know the ranking member has. It's possible some other members will come in, but we may be sort of winding it up here shortly. 2 questions from me, and I guess I'm going to direct this first to Dr. Prado. I was listening to Mr. Donalds. I've got 2 girls, and I sort of ran a similar version of that speech. Dr. Prado, you used a word that I didn't know that I interpreted to mean sometimes when the parent says it's a bad idea, the teenagers think it's a good idea. So what I'm really interested in is, and there's kind of echoes, I'm old enough to remember Nancy Reagan and Just Say No, and I think there's some question about whether that was sort of an effective campaign or not. So what I'm really interested in, and I'll start with Dr. Prado, but maybe others have different views. I heard somebody say peer mentorship. What, other than parents just saying no, what's effective to deliver the message to young people?
Sure. So programs that give parents tools, programs that develop skills among young people and others, programs that have been evaluated. I'd like to say that and think that I'm fiscally responsible in the sense that I want my dollars to be well spent. And oftentimes what happens with prevention programs is that the dollar isn't well spent because we're spending the dollars on programs that are not effective, that have never been evaluated. So we spend, as a society, DARE, many of us who grew up knowing about DARE, we spent millions, in fact, billions on DARE with no impact. And that's because DARE had not been evaluated in a rigorous way. It was about several years ago, I met with someone in my office at the University of Miami, and she said to me, I want to take this curriculum that I've developed over the past 2 weeks or so, and I want to take it to scale in the school system. And I sort of took a step back and asked her about how the program had been developed, what were the ingredients, the active ingredients, what was she hoping to achieve? And she couldn't answer those questions. She left my office, and I encouraged her to think about those questions. Left my office, and about a year later, maybe a little less, maybe a little bit more, I can't recall exactly, I remember reading about her program in our local newspaper, the Miami Herald. And that program had reached tens of thousands of people since she and I had met. Program had no data behind it, and yet it was being supported financially, and it was being implemented with zero evidence. And so one of the things I'd like to say, again, to really make sure that the investments and when states are provided dollars for these types of programs, that the funding opportunity announcements that are provided by health departments, by community agencies, by cities, that those calls really speak about the importance of these systems, whether it be school systems, primary care systems, mental health systems, about taking evidence-based interventions that have been evaluated as opposed to anything that may have been developed in somebody's backyard.
Yes, Dr.
Yeah, may I add, Dr. Prado, thank you for that. You have just justified the work that I do since I do quantitative analysis. I think something else I want to add to what he's speaking about is evidence-based, but also understanding that as a nation, we're not homogenous, right? So we need to understand that every evidence-based strategy that may work in Miami may not work in South LA, may not work in Wisconsin or Connecticut, right? So understanding and disaggregating the data to better understand how policies can directly affect the community it's intended to affect. And so some of this may be cultural competence, right? When you're dealing with an overwhelmingly Hispanic population or overwhelming Black population, there may be differences in that approach than you may see in an overwhelmingly white population. So I think understanding the heterogeneous effect that these policies may have are also very important.
Thank you. Great point. I'm glad you made it. Mr. Gray, I saw Dr. Pinnell raise her hand, and I'll ask you each to be just real brief because I've got just one more question.
Back to what Dr. Prado was saying about things that actually work in schools. We have seen that early intervention education actually does work in our schools with, example, tobacco prevention. We have seen tobacco use steadily decline until, unfortunately, the COVID pandemic, and then because of stressors, it increased. So we do know that targeting our youth does work. And that's something that right now the Mississippi is actually really working hard on, is going ahead and getting substance abuse and mental health curriculum implemented in our schools. Yesterday, I was on the phone with FaceTiming my oldest daughter, and she's like, "Mom, I can't watch you on YouTube in school." And I was like, "Well, how come?" She's like, "We can't talk about drugs in school." The teacher said we can't talk about drugs. That is a huge problem. How are they going to know about drugs and fentanyl if we aren't educating them about it? So, I mean, I still think that early intervention is key in all of this, and getting this substance abuse and mental health curriculum implemented in schools would be worth every dollar.
Mr. Gray, got something done?
Yeah, just very briefly. You questioned, Mr. Chairman, you questioned the Just Say No of Nancy Reagan. I think Dr. Prado questioning the validity or the effectiveness of DARE. And that just goes more to my point. Things like Just Say No and DARE happened in the old paradigm when you were trying to communicate to people under substance use disorder or people who hadn't started using drugs yet, neither of whom really cared about those messages or listened. Kids got into it in school maybe because they were doing what they did in school, but nobody really listened. My suggestion is, with this growing segment, this growing constituency of kids who aren't under substance use disorder, who aren't using out of any sort of deficiency or difficulties, that these types of communication campaigns have a new place. And back to, I think, Mr. Steele, your question about what can we do differently in this new paradigm. Let's get that kind of communication going, because I think it can be effective with these populations. Mr. Chairman, if I could just say one other thing before you wrap up the meeting. My partner here, Ed Kobilis, is here, who lost his son in what I call a characteristic new paradigm. If you might just, at some point before you wrap up, if you might be able to address and just mention his son's name, and is that possible?
Sure. Why don't you bring him to the mic right now? Sure.
Yeah, okay. Ed.
Or sir, just join us at the end of the table there. And sir, just we're grateful you're with us, but keep it to a minute or two, please.
Okay. Yeah, this is, speaking from parents' perspective. Every 6 minutes, we are losing someone's child to drugs. A majority of those deaths can be attributed to fentanyl, a synthetic drug that arrived on our shores in 2013. In the last 9 years, fentanyl has taken the lives of hundreds of thousands of mostly young Americans. Kids as young as 12 years old are dying in numbers that we have never seen before. The United States has been fighting the drug crisis for decades, but today we were up against something so deadly, so powerful, and sadly, we are losing this fight badly. This insidious lethal poison, fentanyl, is 50 to 100 times stronger than heroin. That in itself should garner everyone's attention. But the real tragedy is the deception. Every single day in America, People, mostly teenagers and young adults, are dying from what they think is a legitimate prescription pill. What they believe is an OxyContin, a Xanax, a Percocet is in fact fentanyl. I, along with Michael Gray and Virginia Krieger, have founded the Fentanyl Awareness Coalition. Not a day goes by where we don't come in contact with a grieving parent who has buried their child after taking a single pill. The entire illicit U.S. drug supply is contaminated with fentanyl. No pills are safe, and there have been a number of deaths attributed to cocaine tainted with fentanyl, and it's even in marijuana now. The days of drug experimentation are long gone. Thousands are dying long before they ever become addicted. These untimely and sudden deaths of non-addicts or recreational users are the fastest growing population of drug deaths in America. In essence, they are poisonings. They are not overdoses. On July 4, 2018, my 20-year-old son, Eddie, fell victim to fentanyl poisoning. Just the day before, July 3rd, my family was planning a get-together like we do every year, family and friends for Independence Day. Life couldn't have been better. My daughter Michelle was in the process of making wedding plans. My wife Marianne was approaching retirement, and we were planning our future. And a little bit about my son, Eddie. He had just turned 20 and recently graduated from electrician school. He had worked from the time he was 15 years old, everything from delivering pizzas to plowing snow in the winter to helping his friend with his painting business. His current job at the time was working in a local restaurant 5 to 6 nights a week. Eddie was a saver. He would often give me his entire paycheck to put in the bank, and 2 months earlier he made his first purchase, a new car. My wife and I were so proud of him and took great satisfaction in watching him blossom into a fine young man. The last time I saw my son alive was on the early evening of July 3rd. I remember him pulling into the driveway and hearing his car door slam. I was sitting in the living room, looked out as he was walking toward the front door, and I said to myself, that's my son. How proud I was of him. He had just returned from working out at the local gym. This once skinny kid with acne had grown into a handsome and muscular young man. We had a brief exchange of words as he walked into the house. Eddie was excited. The restaurant where he worked was closed for the 4th of July week. He finally had a night off. He was going to meet some friends later that evening. Eddie never made it out of the house that night. I found him face down on the floor the following morning, the 4th of July. I was in shock. I'm trained in CPR, but there was nothing I could do. His body was cold, his face was distorted, he was gone. Not long after, we found out that he had purchased what he thought was a single Xanax pill. It was actually straight fentanyl. Months later, the toxicology report confirmed this. The way and the manner in which Eddie died, unknowingly consuming what we now call a fentapill, has become commonplace. Not a single day goes by now where I don't hear from a grieving parent who has lost their child in a similar manner. I am urging everyone here to help me launch an aggressive awareness campaign, an informational campaign that educates and sounds the alarm that no pill, unless prescribed by a doctor, is safe. We're losing a generation of kids. The time for action is now.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. As I said to Mr. Gray, I know I'm not alone in being awed of people and parents who have gone through that and can turn that into something around advocacy and being positive. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
And I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity. This meant so much to me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I've got one last little question, then I want to ask the ranking member to wind us up here. This is a little bit tangential, but I think it's actually really important. The ranking member actually in his opening remarks made reference to it. We're apparently holding up the federal budget right now in the United States Senate. I'm not following it closely because it gives me a stomach ache, but over the distribution of crack pipes in needle exchanges. And I don't know about crack pipes. It doesn't sound like a good idea to this lay person, but I have spent a lot of time on the issue of needle exchanges. And as a lay person, I get it, right? It's uncomfortable to imagine that you might, in a safe environment, distribute needles to addicts. But I think the facts are, and this is a question actually, are pretty incontrovertible. And I mean, I remember the story of when our last Vice President, Mike Pence, was governor of Indiana. and those needle exchanges were shut down, the rate of HIV skyrocketed, and then they brought them back, and the rate of HIV came down with all of the positive benefits that has. In New York City, they've got some exchange programs where people go, I think they intercede in some very dangerous situations because if somebody's using it and they're doing it, and of course there's opportunities for engagement around helping people get out of using. So because we're having this very political discussion and I've got a bunch of public health experts in front of us here, from a public health standpoint, and I'm in the politics business, I get the politics of it. But from a public health standpoint, needle exchanges are a net positive, save lives and do good things. Is that correct? And I'll start with the doctors here. And I do want to show respect to the ranking member. So real quick, but I think truth is good, particularly when it's in the service of saving lives, which is why I bring this up.
Sure. When looking at the evidence around harm reduction or syringe service programs, there really is no debate in the public health literature that syringe service programs do help individuals ultimately get into treatment and link them up with treatment, reduces their risk of infectious disease exposure like HIV and hepatitis C. What the West Virginia legislature passed a bill last year that put some restrictions and some guidelines around harm reduction programs, syringe service programs, to ensure that there was a minimum level of service being provided to the individuals that were clients there, and making sure that people did have access to those types of testing, to referral to treatment if they were willing and able, and did require some local input around how those programs were operated. And so for West Virginia, that has served as the compromise between those two political ideas that there is a middle ground there that I think West Virginia has set as an example.
So I don't want to beat a dead horse, and I want to, again, show respect to the ranking member. But from a public health standpoint, I understand the politics. Let me just ask the question, and if the answer, from a public health standpoint, needle exchanges save lives, reduce Hep C, reduce HIV, and provide us with an opportunity to actually treat. Is there a negative public health reason to not do needle exchanges? Okay, all right, that's all. Thank you. We don't have a record, but thank you for, again, I just think, I think if we're about saving lives and improving people's health, we ought to, every once in a while, yank the conversation out of the political. With that, I'll invite Mr. Stile to bring us home here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We heard earlier, I think, an opportunity here for Dr. Grooms and Dr. Prado about how we want to have a localized approach in different demographic groups from the way that you phrased it may have a different approach that's required, but we didn't really hit on how that might be different. I'd love to open it up to either of you. I know, Dr. Prado, you spent a lot of time on this, in particular in the Hispanic community in Miami, and how that may be different than other groups, and would love to just learn more about what that difference may be between different demographic groups that we see in the United States. And you commented in a similar way, Dr. Rumsoff, and whoever would like to start.
I'll start. I think Dr. Prado probably has more to add to this. And in the document I provided, there are some, I didn't speak on it, but I did include some more information. You can see differences across racial demographics, ethnicity, on substances used. So in a recently published paper, we show right now between the ages of over 50, we see an increase of Black individuals entering substance abuse treatment, a sharp increase for cocaine. They don't differentiate crack or powder. And for individuals that are white that are over 50, we see a sharp increase in opioids, but not. And so there's a difference, there's a cultural difference, also location, region of who use substances. But also when we think about substance use treatment, I have ongoing research that looks at biases. There is implicit biases that we all possess, and sometimes that manifests itself in treatment, in who's being treated and are they being treated adequately. So addressing these could help reduce some of those individuals that are still struggling with substance use. And I'll let Dr. Prado.
Dr. Prado?
Thank you, Mr. Stiles. So the program that my colleagues and I developed, to give you an example, is called Familias Unidas, and it's for Hispanic youth. And we focus on ingredients that are very specific to that population. So for example, we focus on acculturation and differential acculturation. Because we work with Hispanic immigrants as part of our sample, what we tend to see is that Hispanic youth, when they come to the US and they embed themselves within the school system and their normal lives, they acculturate very quickly to the culture, to the American culture, where parents often lag behind and they don't acculturate as quickly. And so that gap in acculturation creates very interesting family dynamics between the parents and the youth. And so we address those family dynamics by addressing some of the issues of the acculturation process. So for example, it may be educating parents as to what's normative here in the US for their youth and how they would interact with their peers, which may not be the same way that they may have done with their friends back home. Having said that, and I completely agree with Dr. Grooms that culture and context is really important, oftentimes these programs are very adaptable and they all do have core ingredients or content that really cuts across populations, even though there may be a couple of contents that are very specific to that population. But these programs can easily be adapted. For example, in the dissemination work that my colleagues and I are doing in the state of Pennsylvania, we started working with Hispanics in Chester County. And the program was specifically for Hispanic youth, and the mental health agency that we are working with wanted to implement the program because of its success in non-Hispanic whites. And with relatively minor adaptations from them and from our study team, they have done that and currently are doing it successfully.
Thank you both very much. Thank you to all of our panelists to really highlight a huge challenge that we have. And from a public policy standpoint, it's going to take a multifaceted approach, and I appreciate everybody's testimony here today. Yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, a big thank you to all of you. This is exactly what I had hoped it would be, which was a good dialogue. I thank the ranking member actually for suggesting this roundtable and for some really moving and powerful testimony, as well as some tangible things that I think we can take away to get done. So again, the committee is grateful to all of you, and thanks for being here.